Hello and welcome. Number 9 on my list of favourite trade paperbacks for 2023 is Volume 3 of Stillwater by Chip Zdarsky and Ramón K. Perez. Chip Zdarsky I know from his recent excellent run on Daredevil and from his current run as the writer of Batman. I also remember he did some Howard the Duck stuff at a time when rewatching Guardians of the Galaxy had reignited an interest in the character for me. He's good, typically avoiding thought bubbles or blocks of exposition in favour of simply telling the story he wants to through dialogue, which gives his work a flow that's easy to get into. Makes it perfect for adapting into TV or film too. I'm less familiar with Perez, and by less familiar, I mean that I don't know him at all. Fortunately, it takes far less time to decide whether you like an artist's work than it does a writer's. Just one look should tell you. So after a look, I decided that I liked his work too. It's not as flashy as some of the top artists' work on superhero books, but I think the simpler lines and clearer facial expressions work here. Not that you should take my word for it. By now you've seen some of his work scrolling past and have probably formed an opinion of it yourself. As for discussing what they've created together here, a quick warning. There will be mild spoilers. Not anything huge that I think will ruin your enjoyment of the book. No Bruce Willis was a ghost the whole time. But I am talking about the book, and the series as a whole. And to talk about the book, I feel I need to talk about what happens in the book. So if you've already decided that you will read the book and want to know as little about it as possible when you do, this is a good time to stop watching. But please come back and let me know what you thought of Stillwater. The first of the minor spoilers concerns the basic setup. Most of what I'm about to say is on the back cover of the first volume, so the publishers want you to know this stuff. Okay, so Stillwater is a little town in the middle of nowhere. What makes it different from other little towns, dramatically different, is that nobody dies there. It's more than that though, because the town, everything living in it anyway, is frozen in time. Not aging, not even needing to eat. To protect the secret, nobody is allowed out. As the inhabitants want to present themselves as normal to the rest of the world, and as doing something like walling your town comes across as decidedly abnormal, they have less control over who comes in. They still try and deter visitors, and succeed for the most part, but a few get in. And what happens to these few? Well, generally nothing much. The town puts on a little show, pretending that everything is normal, and the visitor leaves none the wiser. But every so often, someone will see or hear something they shouldn't, and when that happens, the townsfolk don't shy away from using violence. Extreme violence, the blurb says, to protect their home. Okay, so dialing the spoilers up to a solid 2 out of 10, an iffy 2 and a bit out of 11 for any Spinal Tap fans watching. Daniel West and his friend Tony show up in town one day. The reason is that Daniel was sent a letter saying that his great-grand-aunt has died and left him an inheritance that he needed to come to Stillwater to claim. And isn't that the dream? Inheriting from a relative you didn't know you had? It's like winning the lottery without even entering. Not that Daniel is so enthusiastic. He's pretty sure it's all some scam. But he's just lost his job and broken up with his girlfriend, so a road trip is just what he thinks he needs. Or more accurately, it's what his friend Tony thinks he needs, even if there isn't a pot of gold at the end of it. So, undeterred by the surly sheriff's deputy standing guard on the road into town, they arrive in Stillwater, and the aforementioned show commences. But Daniel and Tony are amongst those unfortunates who see something they shouldn't. In their case, a boy being pushed off a roof by another boy. Well, it's not so much that they saw the push, as that after they run to help the grievously injured boy, he gets up and runs away. Daniel and Tony are dragged to the edge of town, where that extreme violence I mentioned earlier is enacted upon Tony. Daniel, however, gets a stay of execution when it emerges that not only was he born in Stillwater, but his mother still lives there. Because of his history, it's decided by the town's judge, Simon Taylor, who runs the town like a dictator, that Daniel can stay. But he must adhere to all the rules of the town like any other resident. In other words, he can never leave. The rest of the first volume primarily concerns itself with the power struggle between the judge, who thinks that the immortality the town grants is a gift, and that absolutely anything should be done to protect that gift, and the townsfolk who think that their charade has gone on for long enough, and that Stillwater should reveal itself to the world. This conflict is something I enjoyed most about the series. Not the battle between the judge and his cronies and the welcome party, as the townsfolk wanting freedom call themselves. There was nothing wrong with this conflict, but nothing groundbreaking either. No, what I mean is the ideological conflict. It gets me wondering, if I lived in a small town, and suddenly, one day, nobody gets sick or dies in that small town, what would I want? Would I want us to close up, nobody in or out, so that we could all continue to live indefinitely? Or would the people and experiences beyond the town's boundary be more important to me? Because I agree with how it's presented in the book, that you couldn't really have both. If you tell the world, or if the world somehow just finds out, people, many of them powerful, who want what your little town has, are going to rush in and take your town and your immortality from you. And that's about the best scenario. You and the other townspeople could also be rounded up and studied and experimented on. All of that might not be legal or ethical, but I can't see it not happening. So if you're going to tell the world, or even if you act in such a way where the world will find out, you're going to lose your town and your immortality. However, if you stay, you're effectively imprisoned. You must also be willing to force this imprisonment on others, because whatever option is chosen, it's chosen for the entire town. There would be no, you can be immortal, I'm going to the beach. That balancing of interests makes it a fun question. One with a fair bit of nuance once you start to think about it. Sort of like what would you do in a zombie apocalypse? Except that this is the only series I've read that asks it. Something else that's fun is the mechanics of how this living forever actually works. It's something I'm sure Zdarsky and Perez had some fun coming up with. As I said earlier, it's not just that Stillwater residents are immortal, it's that they're frozen in time, physically anyway. No matter what happens to them, they'll return to how they were when they first entered the town, or, if they've always been residents, what they were like when the phenomenon they call the stillness first happened. Get pushed off a building, get back up. Have a harvester cut off your foot, it'll just grow back in an hour or so. Some of the repercussions of this are fairly grim, which is the reason the series sells itself as a horror, even if I'm not sure that it is one. There's no reason to get into the details of these repercussions, other than to mention that when Daniel is first told how things work in Stillwater, he's told, thankfully told rather than shown, how cattle are butchered while still alive. It's an effective narration for both explaining how things work and for showing how brutal Stillwater has become, now that death and permanent injury are no longer concerns. The second book broadens the conflict. A small outside militia enters the fray. More interestingly, so do the children of Stillwater. Now you can't see my fingers putting the word children in quotation marks, but that's what they're doing. Because everyone is stuck as they were when the stillness first occurred, which, we learn, was in the mid-80s. So, no new births, and the children who were around when the stillness happened are now in their 40s. As a group, these kids, again air quotes, are justifiably aggrieved that they've never been allowed to grow up. And they're a force to be reckoned with, arguably more so than the militia, because as children, nobody has really taken them seriously over the past 35 years. So they've been able to be within earshot whenever anything important has been discussed without anyone really noticing. And, so the adage goes, knowledge is power. Volume 3 of the series is the final volume of the series, collecting issues 13 to 18, and the one-off special Stillwater The Escape. Which means that the series is 18 issues, more or less, which is a nice length for something like this. Not so long that it evolves into soap opera, but long enough that the story can be properly explored. The special is nice, and it's nice that it was included, but it's not essential, and I think if I had collected the series as individual issues, I wouldn't have sought it out. Basically, it's a collection of short stories about past escape attempts from Stillwater, told by guest writers and artists. Another issue explains how the stillness happened in the first place. It's not a startling explanation, but it suffices. To be honest, with some stories, I think the reason behind what's happening is crucial, and, in those cases, if the reason isn't good, it can tarnish things. In other cases, it really doesn't matter to me, and this story is firmly in that camp. I wouldn't even have minded if no explanation was given, because at its core, this isn't a story about why nobody's dying. It's about how not dying could change the perspectives and morality of people, and in answering those questions, I don't think there were any bum notes. The other 5 issues deal with the meat of the story, the final conflicts, the resolution, the redemption of a character I wasn't expecting to be redeemed. All good stuff. One thing I particularly enjoyed was Daniel as a messianic figure, a dying and rising god. I realize these two things aren't synonymous, but Daniel covers both bases. What I enjoyed was the subverting of expectations, Christian expectations anyway. That a Messiah is there to grant everlasting life to a population destined to die. Here instead, Daniel promises the possibility of death to his immortal supporters. I don't know whether this juxtaposition was planned from the start, as there wasn't much of a build-up to it. Perhaps the issue count was cut at some point and the ending had to be rejigged. Whatever the case, I appreciated it. It was an amusing tidbit in a story that was more grim fun than funny fun, if that distinction makes any sense. And if it does, I can see how others might find the slight change in tone out of place. If you're one of those people, I won't judge you for your opinion, if you agree to do the same for me. So there you have it, Stillwater Volume 3, Border Crossing. Probably worth your time, unless you've just listened to everything I've said and thought, not for me. One last thing, these books didn't do what most trades do and include the covers of the original comic books. I would have preferred that they were here, demarcating the original comics and basically acting as chapter breaks, but it's not a particularly big deal. I do feel a little bad for Ramón Perez though, so I've decided to include them here. For the sake of completeness, I've included the pictures that ended up as the covers for the collected editions too. While they appear on screen, I've got 2 questions for those who read the books. Those who haven't, there will be spoilers here. Actual spoilers that could actually, well, spoil your enjoyment of the book. So unless you really don't care, please stop watching. Have those people gone? Okay, good. First question. There was a lot of tension in Stillwater because the children couldn't grow up within the town's borders, and because they weren't allowed to leave. Which makes sense, but why didn't they just build a house or an apartment building or something where those children could spend their time on the other side of the town's border? Just on the other side, where Stillwater's law enforcement could still keep a close eye on them. The building wouldn't technically be a part of Stillwater, so the children who wanted to stay there would get older, but from the point of view of controlling the population it would. Best of both worlds. A place like that would also allow people who wanted to have children to have them. They could even put a gym there, so one could go there, eat healthily and work out for 6 months, and then return home with an eternal six-pack. I suppose you could argue something along the lines of anything outside of Stillwater proper, no matter how close, would be under the jurisdiction of some outside authority. Even if true, the problem doesn't seem insurmountable, especially to a ruthless town with money and all the time in the world. My second question. It turns out a woman named Clara is responsible for the stillness. I think it's Clara. In my corner of the world we pronounce it Clara, but Americans seem to prefer Clara, so that's what I'm going with. She made a contract with an entity that could have been the devil, and the stillness was the result. Because of the agreement, she is the source of the stillness. She can also never leave Stillwater. So far so good. She lives in Stillwater, so the stillness affects the town. Makes sense. Also on 2 occasions, she was buried. And when she was, the stillness stopped affecting the town. Again, not a problem. The stillness can't escape the soil covering her. Again, easy to understand. What I don't understand, though, and so what I could use your help with, is that Stillwater punishes its citizens, those who have done something that requires a punishment worse than going to jail, which isn't much of a deterrent when you're immortal, but less than execution, by burying them. And the stillness still affects them through the soil. Why the difference? Okay, that's it. Everything I wanted to say about Stillwater. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you stop by again. And goodbye.